Thank you for that. So we're continuing our journey through the Acts, just little episodes illustrating the unfolding of this marvelous story of the church. And I personally love Acts chapter 16 because it is really the story of how the gospel first came to Europe. It's the story of how another threshold was crossed as Paul is led by the Holy Spirit to bring the gospel to what he called Macedonia, what was called Macedonia at the time, part of northern Greece, that brings the gospel into what we would recognize as Europe, and is a stage in a story that has become a world-changing story. God has been working through history, and through history fulfilling his purposes and growing his kingdom. And it's a lovely, lovely story. But it's a lovely story for some other reasons as well. I love it because in terms of the New Testament, it's one of the most beautiful pictures we have of the founding of a church. It's an extraordinary picture because we're given so much information about how this thing comes to be. I don't know if some of you may remember, I don't know if many of you watch existential theatre, but back in the 60s there was a piece of existential theatre called Six Characters in Search of an Author, which, being existential, really was about six people wandering around the stage talking complete nonsense, and then the audience going, "Oh, beautiful, lovely," because nobody actually understood what was going on at all, I don't think. There was a period in history when theatre was defined by the fact that nobody understood it. It was fun. But what's lovely about the story of the founding of the church in Philippi is that we are introduced so deeply to the founding stories of some of the key characters in the church. And that isn't always the case. Quite often, we'll see Paul, and he'll be preaching with his team, and it'll be said, as it says in Acts 17, we're going to look at it tomorrow, many people were added to the church that day, and maybe one or two names are given. But here, we're given insight into the stories of these people. And we're introduced to a number of people, one of whom is Lydia, or the lady from Lydia. Lydia almost certainly wasn't her name, it's actually where she comes from. Interestingly, I'd leave you to ponder this, those of you who are Bible scholars, but it's possible her name could be Euodia or Syntyche, couldn't it? Those of you who know the letter to the Philippians, where Paul wrote to this very church years later and spoke to some women who'd been in a dispute. Who knows what the connections are, because we don't know what this lady's name actually was, but she was a dealer in purple cloth, which means she's a wealthy woman. Shock, horror. A woman of independent wealth is a shocking thing in this culture. Women of independent wealth were women that nobody in the culture knew what to do with. Where do you put a woman of independent wealth? What do you do with her? What's her role in society? It's a very difficult question because she's independent and powerful, but she's living in a society where women are not supposed to be independent and powerful. And she receives the gospel. And she says to Paul, "Come and stay at my house. Make my house the base of your operations." I was trying to think of a sort of relatively contemporary role model, and I thought of the late Anita Roddick, who was a woman of tremendous independent wealth and entrepreneurial spirit. You maybe have other examples in your situation. So we're introduced to this lovely woman, Lydia, who, when she hears the message that Paul brings, as someone who has been seeking after God, she hears it, she recognizes it, she receives it, and her home becomes the base for this new church. But that's not where this story ends, and that's what's interesting, because we're then introduced to another girl who joins the church fairly soon afterwards. And there's a connection, because Lydia gives hospitality